All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Of Knights and Pilgrims. This is a podcast commentary of Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene. This is me, Christian Leithart, and Dr. David Grubbs.
Hello.
I'm going to call you Dr. Grubbs as often as possible. And we are doing this purely because out of love for this book. And that's pretty much it.
Pretty much.
Yeah. So the goal of the podcast is well, I guess we have several goals. One is to just kind of nerd out about this book that we both love, to talk about some of the things that we like about it and why everyone should read it. And secondly, to hopefully give people some support, some scaffolding as they try to get into the book themselves, because there's a lot of barriers to entry for this book, that's one of the things on our agenda to talk about today. So we should probably first talk about what is the Faerie Queene. If you're listening to this, you probably know what it is, but just in case, we will tell you a little bit about the background of the book. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the background?
Sure. The Faerie Queene is by the Elizabethan poet Edmund Spenser. It is a multi-book epic. We have 6 books plus a 7th, which is kind of sort of book 7, but probably I'm never really sure.
Did you mention it's unfinished?
Oh yeah, it's not done either. Like so many great works of literature, the Canterbury Tales, the Aeneid, it's not quite fully cooked.
Which is why there's 6.5 books.
Yeah, six and a question mark, as opposed to 12 is what it was supposed to be. But then he suggested that he might have 12 more in him after that, if he had a good reception.
He might have had 24 in him, but they didn't all make them out
No.
before he died.
No.
We should also probably mention that this book was published in 1590. So that's roughly around the time Shakespeare was writing. Shakespeare continued a little bit after that, and about 80 to 90 years before Milton. So this is a pretty old book, really one of the first major epics, long works of English literature, kind of following Chaucer. But Spenser he kind of developed his own thing. I suppose he has inheritors. As you'll get to know him, you'll realize it's hard to describe this guy, or at least his writing. So it's 6.5 books. What happens in the books?
Mostly the adventures of knights and the sorts of characters that you would expect in a chivalric romance. The closest thing I think that we have to a precursor for the Faerie Queene is the Arthurian literature, which in France, through Chrétien de Troyes and similar writers, is mostly in poetry. But in English, we see it in Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur. But there were English chivalric poems as well, long-form narrative poems. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is probably the one that people best know, but there were others.
Do you think that Spenser was familiar with works like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight? I know that C.S. Lewis, in English literature in the 16th century, excluding drama, he argues that Spenser wasn't really drawing from Malory very much. Is Gawain even mentioned in the Faerie Queene?
No. None of the Knights of Arthur are mentioned because, we'll get into this, but in some sense, the Faerie Queene is kind of the unasked for prequel,
right,
to the Arthurian.
The prequel, no one knew that they needed.
Yes,
but they desperately did.
Yes, he couldn't have known of Gawain and the Green Knight. Gawain and the Green Knight exists only in one copy. It was in a manuscript in the Cottonian Library, along with Beowulf and some other things. So that no one would have known of. I don't know that anyone would have known of Gawain and the Green Knight in Spenser's day.
We are lucky to know of it now.
Indeed, we are. But there were more popular romances and verse romances that had larger circulation. I don't think the Faerie Queene is based on Malory, but when we get to talking about the language of the Faerie Queene, I think that's probably where the closest the closest thing to a similarity exists.
I think there's another source for the content, but before I talk about that, we should probably add the other aspect to the poem. It's not just an adventure story; it is also a extended allegory, and probably best known for being an allegory in the sense that there are characters in it that represent concepts or ideas or places, and they are sort of meant to represent that. But as we kind of get into the story, you'll see that the allegory is quite complex and doesn't always go where you would expect it to go. Allegory kind of gets dismissed sometimes, like, oh, if you figure out who represents what, then you figured it out, like a political satire or something. But this is not it kind of starts that way, and then quickly you realize, wait, if this character represents that, but then he does this to this character, is Spenser saying that like this quality defeats that quality in a person? And that it makes for some really intriguing moments in the story, knowing that there's a conscious attempt at allegory.
Yeah, scholars and readers of Spenser debate over the degree to which the narrative, especially as you go through later books. Book one is relatively tight as an allegory, but the further you go, the more the narrative seems to take over for the joy of itself. But then again, if you slow down and start reading carefully, the allegory starts surfacing again. And maybe it wasn't Spenser that lost track of the allegory. Maybe it's you.
Yeah, he's much more skillful at it than sometimes people give him credit for. Sometimes you're reading and it comes across as kind of sloppy. Well, so one analogy that might be helpful is in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Mhm.
Santa Claus shows. Well, I guess
Yeah.
Father Christmas shows
Yes.
up, and I think
With
Tolkien
a sewing
famously
machine.
hated that part,
Yes.
right? Because it seemed inconsistent to him. And I think Spenser shares some of that same attitude. I heard the term from Alan Jacobs. I don't know where he heard it from, but mythopoeic promiscuity, where there's just ideas floating around in Spenser's mind and he's just pulling from whatever he remembers. But since he's a good storyteller and poet, all of those things that seem to be so separate end up kind of being assembled in somewhat of a consistent whole. I wish he'd finished.
A kind of, well, it's chivalric romance, so you should always expect the odd in chivalric romance. But this is odder than most. But there's still kind of a weird consistency in the world. There are places you can go to more than once. It's not like Alice in Wonderland.
Or what's that kid's book with the oh man, I should not have started saying this. The little kid on a trip and he meets a clock.
Oh yeah,
The Phantom Tollbooth.
Yeah, Phantom Tollbooth. Phantom Tollbooth is getting closer. Or Pilgrim's Progress. The first time you read it, it feels kind of dreamlike as Christian moves through this landscape that's of sequential experiences that are each charted carefully on a Christian experience. But then when you read Pilgrim's Progress 2, you realize that this is actually a durable geography that other people can visit and interact with in ways that were different from Christian.
Right.
It stops being a kind of psychological experience made concrete and becomes more of a secondary, sort of a secondary reality kind of fantasy.
Right. You could make you could write another story that takes place in Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress land. Whereas it's like you said, there's a consistent geography. The slough is here, and the mountains are here, and the castle is here. I remember like Pilgrim's Progress has always been my kind of go-to example of sort of stiff allegory where it's like, this is this, this is this. But then I read part 2, where Christian's wife goes to the celestial city, and it gets way more complicated in terms of the creativity of the characters, and people show up and you're like, wait, so are you truth? Are you representing strength? Like what are you supposed to be, you know?
Right.
And Spenser definitely is more on that level of things. So it's a adventure story, it's an allegory, And I think that we maybe should move on to where we, well, before we talk about where we came to this book, I think I want to mention some of the impact it's had on other people, that some of our favorite authors maybe. Or maybe we should talk about that after. Let's go over our own history with it first. So I was assigned this book in English Lit class in high school. We only read book one. Like Dr. Grubbs said, it's the most consistent, probably the tightest, most accessible of the stories. So we read book one. It was kind of tough going. The teacher was very patient with us, helped us along, had us draw pictures. Spenser's very visual, a lot of visual descriptions. And that it just helped with understanding a lot. And it kind of like captured my imagination in a way, almost like you read it and you go, like, I feel like I've heard this somewhere before. There's just this sort of like deep familiarity with some of the images in it that's hard to describe. The next time I encountered it was I think in a college class where we read a modernization of it by a guy named Roy Maynard, and that's published by Canon Press. It's called Fierce Wars and Faithful Loves. And if you haven't read the book before, that's a fine place to start. It updates some of the spelling of the original and has some helpful notes in it. And then when I was in grad school, I tackled the book again. It just kind of kept coming up in my life, and that's when I sort of originally read some of the secondary literature on it. And nowadays there seem to be people that read Spenser for the sake of like criticizing him for Irish colonialism. Yeah. But for a long time, it seemed like only really big fans of Spenser were reading Spenser.
Yes.
And so you read the secondary literature and it just felt like this is like this little club that people just get together and hang out and talk about one of their favorite poems. It was just a delightful group to be a part of, even though many of the scholars had been deceased or inactive for many decades by the time I found them. So, and I should mention also that some friends and I made a short film of one of the one of the cantos when I was in high school of the Despair episode.
Awesome.
It was.
That one stuck with you.
Oh yeah, it did. I mean, if you make something into a film, it sticks with you for sure. Okay, how about you?
So I first encountered it, I think, also in high school. I believe it was in some kind of a language updated or retold version. I couldn't tell you what the press was that published it, but it was not even the entire book one. It was bits of book one. I think mostly the error fight might have been the only thing, which is Canto 1 of book one. And I remembered finding it interesting and thinking that it was neat that this book existed. But I think maybe the version that I was reading it in overplayed the difficulty of Faerie Queene's language and the complexity of the allegory to the point where I was frankly a bit intimidated at the idea of the Faerie Queene. I liked the bit that I had read, and I wasn't averse to allegory. Pilgrim's Progress has been one of my favorite books since I got my first kind of version of the Pilgrim's Progress that I read as a child when I was, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8, something like that. So
it was an adapted or children's version?
Yeah, it was an adapted Pilgrim's Progress, but it was the whole trajectory of book one of Pilgrim's Progress.
Was it the one that's like lavishly illustrated and kind of like almost Arthur Rackham style disturbing illustrations? There's one called Dangerous Journey that we had.
It was not Dangerous Journey.
Okay. Yeah.
It was not Dangerous Journey, but it was fully illustrated. I couldn't tell you the publisher. I've got it at home somewhere in a box, like so many.
If this were a video podcast, you could bring it in,
right? I'm like, look at the lavish illustrations. I've read it to my daughter, and she enjoyed it as well. there were some pictures in it that kind of stuck with me and haunted me.
As they should.
Yeah. Yeah, you should, if you have Pilgrim's Progress read to you as a child, there are parts that should rightly freak you out
Right.
and haunt you. Anyway, so I'd read this a little bit in high school, but sort of formed the conclusion from the introductory material that by the time I ever got to a copy of the Faerie Queene, which we did not have one at home, that I would probably find it too difficult. So I didn't pursue it further. In college, we read what of the chunk of the Faerie Queene that was in the Norton Anthology of English Literature. I know a goodly chunk of the opening cantos of Book One is in that. Okay. I can't remember how much is in the Norton, but I don't think we read much more than the Canto One and the fight with error, and that somewhat confirmed my
that it was difficult.
My impressions that my earlier impression that it was difficult, and my teacher, Dr. Gary Green, peace be upon him, he played up the language and the difficulty of the language, but in a way that was more playful, savoring the oldness, right? He had almost kind of a sommelier's delight in the different
rolling
idioms.
the words around in his mouth.
Yes, the flavors of English over the centuries. He's the first person I'd ever heard speak Old English. First person I ever heard speak Middle English. It was a really good semester.
And that was in college or grad school?
That was in college.
Okay.
That was in college. But I'd tasted a little more, right? Tasted a little more and found it tough going. But then in graduate school, I was studying medieval literature. But that was my focus. Reading Middle English, beginning my kind of first baby steps in Old English. And in a Renaissance poetry and prose class, reapproached Faerie Queene again. And with more languages under my belt, more versions of older English in my experience, it wasn't as tough as I remembered. I remembered enjoying it, but even then I didn't read the whole thing. That was not until I was at the University of Georgia working on my PhD, and there was a Spenser course, whole semester just Spenser, and we were supposed to read the whole Faerie Queene.
How many people in the class did?
Oh, golly, that would be telling. I really don't know.
So this is where I jump in and admit to your horror, I'm sure, that I have not read the whole thing.
Gasp. Are we doing this podcast to make you read the whole thing?
Yes, in a sense.
Fantastic.
Yeah. No, I've read all of books 1 and 2, and about half of book 3. And then I've read the unfinished book. I was drawing on that partly for a paper in grad school. But I think it was partly because there was so much to read about book 1.
Yeah.
And so much I could write about without reading the rest that it just kind of, the book is as thick as my index finger is long.
Yeah, no, it's a big fat book.
Yeah. So when you're in grad school and you're like scrambling to finish a paper, you don't think, I'm going to spend the next 2 weeks reading this.
Right. Especially if you're reading about Spenser as you are reading Spenser, you are
overwhelming.
Yes, it is an overwhelming amount of material. Even a really good edition of Spenser is going to be heavily footnoted, heavily endnoted. What does the Penguin Classics page look like?
It's not bad.
It's just the text. That's not
yeah,
too
it's
bad.
a lot of blank white space. The notes are in the back.
And there's the endnotes.
Yeah.
Wow, that's
it's Thomas Roche, I believe,
cool.
The editor.
So if you're looking up all the notes, you're just it's slowing you down. Yeah. So reading Spenser in that class, you asked the question, how many people read all of it? Based on the conversation we were having in class, my impression was that far more people in the class were reading about Spenser than were actually reading Spenser,
That's
because
grad school for you.
they wanted to talk about the Irish thing.
Yeah.
They wanted to talk about um, the big hot book was Stephen Greenblatt's Renaissance Self-Fashioning, which has a heavy drawing upon Spenser and Spenser's Gold for the Faerie Queene in it. And so we ended up talking about Stephen Greenblatt a lot. And
I'm sorry.
it was pretty clear that most of the folks who were in the class were interested in the things that Spenser was adjacent to, less than they were interested in reading the story of the Faerie Queene for its own sake.
That almost seems like just how higher education, like in English literature for the last 20, 25 years or so, that's just what it's been.
I think that was some of it. The other thing is that for most of the folks in the class I know, Shakespeare was their home base. They were really engaged in Shakespeare, engaged in the narrative of Shakespeare. They were fans. And they were in love with the historical period, the politics, the culture, the society of Elizabethan England. And so for them, Spenser was another route to the thing that they were actually there for, which was understanding Elizabethan England more deeply.
Yeah. So then I can understand his pathway into politics and
yeah.
all that stuff,
Every political aspect of the Faerie Queene was deeply, deeply examined. The faith of the Faerie Queene and the virtue ethics of the Faerie Queene were mostly left to the side as uninteresting.
Okay. I mean, I profoundly disagree.
Also, I met my
that.
wife in that class.
Okay, well, it was worth
so that was cool too.
Was she one of the ones who read the whole thing or not?
She had already read a lot of it in college.
Oh, wow. Okay.
She showed up in that class as a fan of the Faerie Queene. You were talking about making a movie of the despair scene. In college for a project, they had made a movie of some scenes from book 3 in the adventures of the Lady Knight Britomart.
Yeah. Well, that's a good one. Yeah.
So she came into that class loving the Faerie Queene, wanting to talk about the Faerie Queene, and her memory of that class is largely of frustration.
Yeah. Yep. I can understand.
Of wanting to actually nerd out about the story in a room full of people who mostly were wanted to remove the story and talk about the way the story gave them access to context.
Right. Yep. That was my grad school experience as well.
Yeah.
So that was the last time you tackled it, but
I've taught it since then in English literature surveys. I loved it at that point. At that point, I was living off campus. I'm a PhD student living off campus in a cheap apartment that had the virtue of having an actually well-maintained swimming pool.
Wow.
So I read whole swaths of the Faerie Queene just sort of in the shallow end of the pool.
Wow. That's you may be the only person in the world that's done that.
It was it's a weird strain of decadence.
Yeah.
I will admit.
Yeah.
but yeah, read a whole lot of the Faerie Queene in the pool and loved it. So yeah.
So I think we're probably going to get into the content of it soon, but I think before we do that, I want to mention some of the influence it's had on people, and maybe we could talk about why there's such a high barrier of entry, and then maybe where people can start. Sure. So this may come up naturally, but it probably bears mentioning that this book had a huge influence on C.S. Lewis. Not only on his ideas of what literature could do and be, but also just on his imagination. Like there are parts of the Faerie Queene that appear in other works of Lewis, or very similar things. In one of I guess maybe an apocryphal pseudo Lewis story, I don't know, The Dark Tower, there's a character named Scudamore, which is a character from the Faerie Queene. There's other parts of his work, either the Space Trilogy or the Chronicles of Narnia, that are heavily reminiscent of the Faerie Queene. I don't recall coming across too many references to it in Tolkien's work. He was kind of down on allegory, which makes me wonder whether he fell in love with it. And he was also very strict about world building in his books. And I think in the foreword to Lord of the Rings, he even says, "I prefer history. I like reading history." And I think Spenser may have been just too messy for him.
Based on there's a book came out a few years ago called Tolkien's Modern Reading.
Yes, I remember you mentioning that before.
Oh, I need to remember the author's name off the top of my head.
Was this the book that had the picture of Tolkien in front of his bookshelf?
Yes.
And people zoomed up on the titles to see what Tolkien, what he had.
Holly Ordway. Yeah, Holly Ordway. Wonderful. Wonderful book. Tolkien's Modern Reading. He read actually a lot of novels, a lot of history, but he preferred a straight narrative, a narrative that's not, he'd expressed a contempt of allegory. Not that Tolkien was averse to symbolism,
right,
or the applicability of theme. Certainly, if you read his landmark essay on Beowulf, is full of him making arguments about the connection of the narrative to themes. But I do think that Tolkien's imagination was captured very early on through the means of Andrew Lang's the color fairy books.
The blue fairy book, red fairy book.
Yeah, all the different color fairy books with mythology, especially Norse mythology,
right.
And then later on encountering Welsh mythology. So that I don't find a lot in Tolkien that reminds me of chivalric romance.
No.
His imagination is mostly captured by what would be the literature of earlier periods.
Right. I'm in the middle of the Fellowship of the Ring, and Aragorn, the great love song of Middle Earth, is basically about a bride who dies.
Yes.
And that's sort of what for Tolkien seems to have been what high romance looked like.
Yeah,
was dead lovers. That was kind of, I guess it's very Norse, it seems,
Yeah, there's always an element of the tragic.
Yeah,
in
for sure.
Tolkien's moments of beauty. I don't think that he believed that beauty in this mortal world could exist without the piercing pain of losing it.
Yeah. Well, this is not a podcast about
Tolkien. Not a podcast about Tolkien.
I wish. Well, maybe we could do a separate one. But so over the centuries, Spenser continued to have devoted fans. We know Milton was a fan. He mentions Spenser as a teacher in Areopagitica, right? If I pronounced that correctly.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if Shakespeare was influenced by Spenser. Over the years, Spenser's poetry, his long poems, were used as models for other poets. The Faerie Queene, again, there's kind of an undercurrent of the Faerie Queene, but I don't recall anybody who was really, really captured by it and tried to, imitate that aspect of it until, honestly, the next great fantasy from England is probably The Lord of the Rings. Am I missing one? There's got William Morris, who's pre-Tolkien, right?
Yeah, William Morris started with translations of medieval narrative, Icelandic sagas specifically, but then lateraled into what could be called the earliest sort of secondary world fantasies.
Yeah.
Some of which had connections with historical past in Europe, and some of which do not map onto the historical world.
Yeah. I almost wonder if George MacDonald was a fan of it. There's something about MacDonald stories that have a similar, like a Faerie Queene feel.
Yeah. Fantasties.
Yeah, for sure.
Probably taste the most like
Yeah.
Faerie Queene.
Yeah. But less action.
Well,
There's a lot of hewing in the Faerie Queene.
less action. Far more people have their heads split to the chin
Yes.
and
Yeah.
so forth.
So in more modern era, I know that J.K. Rowling is a fan
Really?
of the Faerie Queene. She has in her private library at her home, she has a quote from the Faerie Queene painted on the wall. I can't remember which one it is, but and then in her Cormorant Strike, is that the name of her? She's got this whole other detective fiction.
I haven't read any of those.
Under the name Robert Galbraith.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
one of them is called Troubled Blood, which is a quote from the Faerie Queene. So
Okay.
she's a fan.
Cool.
So maybe this would be a good time to talk about why it's always been an undercurrent and why Spenser's never quite gone mainstream. And the explanation always given, which I think David disagrees with slightly, is that the Spenser consciously wrote in an archaic form.
Yes.
With like trying to imitate Chaucer, trying to make his stories feel older and just like a tale that had been handed down. So intentionally using old words, old spelling. And so that's always kind of been the reason I've heard. And probably the big reason why people don't, apart from just the intimidating length, the big reason why people don't just pick up this book and just start reading it. Or why people don't teach it in schools. There's few high schools that teach the book. But I know you have some thoughts on the difficulty of the language.
When it was first presented to me, and I said back in high school, reading a sort of retold modern language version, that it was the introduction to the Faerie Queene in that text said something very much like what you just said, that it was impenetrably archaic, right? Presented as this nigh insurmountable obstacle to the modern reader. You might as well not even try. It's just really impossible, is kind of how it was presented in that high school text, which it isn't. It is challenging. It is difficult. And the first time you're reading it, you should read something that has good, I think good footnotes for vocabulary. I appreciate the cleanness of the Penguin Classic page, having only Spenser's text on there. But if that's your first experience reading the book, you're just going to spend most of your time in the endnotes.
Right, for sure.
So having a text that has nice glosses in a margin or at the foot of the text is probably a kinder way.
Right. So there are other. I was going to mention. So I already mentioned the book published by Canon Press. They have book one, which is Fierce Wars and Faithful Loves, and they have this second one too called The Elven Knight.
Cool.
They have. When I emailed them about book three, they said they had a manuscript and weren't publishing it for some reason. I guess the second one probably didn't sell very well. And I also have come across
that is sad.
Yeah, it is, because it's probably a little bit better than book two. But I also came across recently in the last year or so a under process prose version that's trying to stick with the words as much as possible.
Cool.
But just reordering them and updating them into prose. I think it's connected with Rabbit Room, Andrew Peterson's group, but it's called, I think the press is called Skylark Press, but if you go to faeriequeene.com, spelled in the difficult way that Spenser spells it, you'll see some of their illustrations, pretty cool.
Ooh.
I am eager to get a copy of this when it's ready. It's not ready yet. They have plans to do the whole thing.
Oh, that's so pretty.
Illustrated. So there are places to start with prose.
Oh, there's Arthur.
Yeah.
It's Arthur because he's got a dragon on his hat.
Right. And on his cloak.
Yes.
So I'm very excited about this one. I hope, I've got high hopes for it for sure.
Cool.
But I will say that for me, one thing that has hugely helped recently is David pointed out that on LibriVox, there is a guy named Thomas Copeland, Copeland, who has an audio version of The Faerie Queene that is fantastic. The guy is not at all intimidated by the text. He reads it like he knows exactly what's going on, which I'm sure he does. And if you just listen to him read, you won't even notice strange spellings. There'll be a few words that you might not understand, a few lines that aren't super clear. But the spelling, which is, like we said, kind of archaic spelling, it will just go right by you. It is difficult to follow if you have trouble following audiobooks that you're not familiar with. So I can say from in my experience, I read the original first, which was difficult. I find the modernized metrical version really, really helpful because I like to see the poetic lines. But I would highly recommend the audio version because you get to hear the way that Spenser puts things. And there is something, I think, special about the poetry. Like I said, I have high expectations for the prose version, but I am also, I think people really, you should go back to the poetry eventually because there are qualities that the poem has that no prose version is going to capture. That said, if a kid picks up that amazingly illustrated prose version and falls in love with the Faerie Queene, that would be great.
Yes.
No problem with that.
Yeah, I have zero issue with adaptations. If adaptations help you, as you say, fall in love with the narrative, fall in love with the world, it's easy for that to serve as a route into the real thing. The real thing then becomes the treasure that you can work towards, because you already love what's there. You see a value in it, which is how I felt towards Beowulf as a student. That the text of the Old English of Beowulf was a treasure that I was working towards recovering because I already valued the poem through translations.
Yes, and what's funny is the opposite happened to me with the Aeneid, where I vastly preferred the Greek epics. I thought the Aeneid was kind of dry and like, why are we retreading all the same stuff we read in Homer?
Yeah.
But then when we tackled it in Latin class, I suddenly came to appreciate the skill behind the Aeneid, and that has caused me to appreciate it in translation more, just knowing how rich the Latin text is.
So I do want to dispel, not entirely, the claim that Spenser is intentionally writing in this impenetrably archaic language in order to make it sound like ye oldie timies. If you look at the Luminarium or edition of the Faerie Queene online or the Penguin Classics edition, most good editions of the Faerie Queene include Spenser's letter to Walter Raleigh, which explains a lot of his intentions for the text. But if you look at that letter, it has in it a lot of the same peculiarities of spelling that are in the Faerie Queene. It has V's for U's and U's for V's, used with almost a just casual disregard of system. Strangely doubled consonants in places where modern spelling doesn't double them, especially words ending with a double consonant and an E, where it does not in modern English. So spelling the word do as in to do something, D-O-E. Right? All of these things are in Spenser's letter to Raleigh. They're Elizabethan spellings.
So, that prompts the question, I think, why hasn't... So something like Shakespeare, written in the same form.
And that's why, yeah.
But why is it that we have, like, nobody reads Shakespeare in that original spelling? Why is it that Spenser has remained so static?
Yeah,
whereas
if you look at
no one's going to read Dryden or Herbert or Donne in these weird spellings. We always update them.
So there is self-conscious archaism in the Faerie Queene's language, but it's primarily in his diction. He will use certain words that were associated with particularly chivalric romance. Someone is the Y at the beginning of a verb, like iclad.
Yes.
or someone is called something yclept,
Yes.
or another word to be called something height. They were
Yes.
named height, Scudamore. Um, the word wight, W-I-G-H-T, to mean a human soul.
Mickle, is that one of them?
Mickle,
Means strong.
yes, to mean strong,
Yeah.
or much great,
Yeah.
something like that.
I always remember eek.
Yes.
E-K-E.
Yes.
Meaning also. Right?
Yeah. Eek is also, or like or phrase instead of either or.
Well, that's a Latin thing.
Yes.
Yeah. That's not Old English, but.
Well, but you do see it in older forms of English.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Perhaps because they're approximating Latin.
Yeah.
You're right. If you look at the first, the oldest published Shakespeare that we have, like the early Shakespeare quartos, they also have the same spelling.
Yeah.
V's and U's interchangeable and all the rest of it. But we are so used to encountering Shakespeare in a modernized spelling text. I think that has to do with ideas we have about Shakespeare. We think of Shakespeare as being a dramatist of the now. And the now was Elizabethan and then Jacobean England. But the sense that he was writing in the current language of the day, in some sense, frees us to regularize that spelling. In the sense, the degree to which Shakespeare is still performed, it makes it accessible. People don't feel bad about regularizing the spelling of Shakespeare. But there's this perception in the Faerie Queene that to modernize the language of the Faerie Queene is to lose it.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, I would agree.
Yeah.
There's almost something like maybe he was successful in making it feel like this older thing that you are discovering.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not like I said, if your pathway into the Faerie Queene is maybe if they turn it, Amazon turns it into some kind of miniseries, and that's how you get into it, then that's great.
Faerie Queens of Power.
Yes.
I mean, it's got a lady knight in it. How are they going? How are they not gonna?
So, I mean, if that's your pathway in, that's fine. Like, I'm not going to blame you. But eventually, I feel like somehow getting back to the Mickle White and Yclept Scudamore.
Yes.
And there's it just has this rhythm.
Then footered his spear.
Yeah. Well, and also sometimes sometimes by modernizing Spenser, you miss certain things he's doing with the poetry. Like even just something as simple as you miss a beat in the rhythm.
Mm-hmm. You miss the rhyme?
Yeah. So there's a great video of David Crystal, who's an English language scholar, and his son is a Shakespearean actor. And they reconstructed Shakespearean pronunciation. They call it the OP, the original pronunciation, which is kind of bold. But when he recites parts of Shakespeare, there's rhymes and sounds there that you miss in a modern translation.
Isn't that how they reconstructed it? They started with the presupposition
that it would rhyme,
that there were no half rhymes.
Yeah. So like move and love sound the same in their, in their reconstructed pronunciation.
That's pretty cool.
So, but I do think that if you modernized Spenser, I agree you would kind of miss some of that.
I would love to see. I would love to hear the Faerie Queene read in that reconstructed Shakespearean pronunciation.
Right. I mean, I puzzled over this for a long time because I thought, for a long time I've wanted to do something like this podcast where you're bringing the Faerie Queene to people that haven't heard of it before.
Yeah.
But I thought, an audio version where you could just read it to people and get it in their minds. But I wondered, how do you do that? How do you communicate that? And it seemed to me that adopting some kind of accent would probably make the most sense. But now we've already mentioned Thomas Copeland. I think he does a great job.
Fantastic.
Just regular.
And it's free.
Yeah, right. He does a great job just reading it, and he doesn't bother too much. He'll sometimes do ed, like he'll pronounce the ed for the sake of the rhythm. but
Or
a
he'll
lot of it
pronounce
he'll just
something a little
ignore.
different to make the rhyme work.
Yeah.
But I mean, I cannot praise Thomas Copeland's reading The Faerie Queene enough. LibriVox.org. There's 2 different versions of The Faerie Queene on LibriVox. One is a team effort recording that's book by book, and then there's one it's Faerie Queene second version, I think is what they call it.
VER2 or
Yeah,
something.
or
like that.
version 2.
Yeah.
And that's all one reader. That's all
Yeah.
this Thomas Copeland fellow, who I wish I knew more about. I Googled him hard one day, couldn't find anything that seemed like it was that guy.
Same guy.
Yeah, but he read for LibriVox. He read The Faerie Queene. He read Paradise Lost. He's read a lot of big, older texts, and you can tell he knows exactly what it means. He gives every character, every moment, the emotional quality that it ought to have. He reads the lines the way they ought to be read if read aloud. He knows what he knows the story.
Yeah.
And if you listen, it's like having the footnotes and the glosses and all the rest of it. The difficult vocabulary is still there, but you know what the sentence means. You know that this is an exciting fight scene, or someone pleading for her life, or a description of unspeakable horrors, or whatever.
It really makes you, it just, I think, like solidly argues that this was meant to be read out loud. Because like all the difficulties of understanding the spelling and what on earth is this word supposed to be, they just vanish when you're listening. The hard part, at least for me, is that if I'm listening to something, I have a hard time following sometimes if it's complex. Like the first time going through something like the Odyssey, you just lose track of who's talking and is this a real thing, or are they talking about their family history, or like a god suddenly appears and starts talking.
The asides.
So if you're not familiar with the Faerie Queene, it might help to just like read some chapter summaries or read an adapted version. I think there's some books out there that are children's versions of the Faerie Queene. I haven't done a lot of research into them, but the more familiar you are with the story, the easier it would be to appreciate, I think, the poem itself.
I want to say there were versions of it in the 1800s of at least some, or maybe in some sense all. We have a book at home called something like Stories from the Faerie Queene.
That is a title I've heard.
And it's very much like Charles and Mary Lamb's stories from Shakespeare, sort of children's versions. Right. There is content in the Faerie Queene that I would not set in front of a 10-year-old. Right. But these are kind of retellings that kind of soften some of the maybe more violent scenes, or the scenes where, I mean, Spenser will present betrayal, infidelity.
There's an attempted rape in book one.
Yeah. I mean, there is some pretty hard content warnings. Not prurient, not. I mean, you could hardly call it graphic, given how difficult the language is. It's practically hidden behind its own language.
Well, I mean, you say that, but I would almost say that Spenser's poetry really shines in depicting images.
Yes.
Almost more than actions. Like you almost, I think that's why I think an illustrated version of the Faerie Queene would be so great, because you would, he's painting these pictures of characters, of places, but it's not like, anyway, so I would in some ways I would describe him as a very graphic poet in the sense that he is good at painting pictures.
Yes.
I think we should probably very quickly talk about the purpose. So why people should read the Faerie Queene, and then maybe we'll close up for this first episode.
Sure.
So hopefully we've communicated that we love the poem, and
Yes.
many people, admirable people throughout history, also love the poem. So purely for the sake of just, it's a great story that you should enjoy and appreciate. There's not a ton of like social references to the Faerie Queene. It's not like reading the Aeneid or
Right.
Cicero or Ovid, where you'll be like, oh, that's where that came from. It just doesn't have that. There's a few. You would feel very smart in a few. Like if you visited J.K. Rowling's library, you'd be like, oh, hey, that's from the Faerie Queene. You could impress her. But
If that's on your bucket list.
Right. But there's not a lot of other like common just references to it. Things aren't named after the Faerie Queene, although they should be.
Yeah.
But I think the delight that people have taken in it over the years, I think, is part of the point. And I think we will have to talk about Spenser's purpose for writing the story.
Yeah.
That may be a longer discussion that we should save for episode 2.
Ooh, the letter to Raleigh.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking we might be able to jump right into Canto 1, but I think we need to talk about the letter to Raleigh and why Spenser said he was writing it.
Yeah.
And maybe we could touch on some of the political angle to it as well.
Sure.
But I think we're going to stop there for this first one. So hope you enjoyed it.